Lele, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by all of his government's statements and actions?
Yes, particularly continuing Labour's work which began in September 2021 on AUKUS Pillar 2 with the help of honest, Honourable Andrew Little's endorsement.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Who is correct? Mark Mitchell, who said on News Talk ZB this morning that the government would keep the firearms registry as it is, or Nicole McKee, who said, quote, the full Category A licensing regime is not going to be effective, it's going to be too costly, and it's going to make people fearful of their safety? Detail.
The reality is that the final product has yet to be produced, and ministers and the Cabinet are working on those, and when that's complete, we'll be delighted to answer you in full.
Supplementary question. So was Mark Mitchell incorrect when he said that the government would be keeping the firearms registry as it is?
One more time. The Cabinet, alongside the ministers in charge of this legislation, is working on it at this point in time. We're hearing submissions. We're taking as wide a possible look at this in the interests of New Zealand's long-term safety and not trying to make cheap political points out on the way through.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition is going to come to the House and quote members, then he has to have an accurate quote. He can't make things up. And his last question was made up. It's quite simply, I didn't say that.
I think that the point has always been with supplementary questions that there might be, if he said it was a quote, he simply asked if someone was right. The assertion is enough in a supplementary question. So we'll ask it again.
I think we've already moved on from that question, Mr. Speaker. I was up to my next one, but
I wasn't aware there was an
I'm happy to go back and repeat it again if you would like.
No.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, why won't he say that the government won't be changing the firearms register, given every party in Parliament except the ACT Party voted in favour of it, and his party, the National Party, to the Prime Minister, indicated before the election it would keep the firearms register?
Mr. Speaker, one more time, it's been a long-standing habit of members of this side of the House to, as Phil Collins said, hear both sides of the story. And we're finding out what that is, and when we know what both sides of the story are, in the interest of New Zealand's long-term safety, we seek to make the right decision and not to cheaply politicise what was a disastrous event.
Supplementary question. Does he agree with his soon-to-be Deputy Prime Minister's refusal to rule out leaving the coalition over the so-called Treaty Principles Bill? And if so, what measures will he take to avoid the coalition collapsing?
Mr. Speaker, it would be not respectful or democratic of me to seek to answer on behalf of the person, the minister he's talking about.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. He is answering on behalf of the Prime Minister. He can't say that it wouldn't be respectful for him to answer on behalf of the Prime Minister when that is his job.
Well, I would ask the Leader of the Opposition to think carefully about his question, because what the Prime Minister just responded was that he wouldn't speak for the other party to the question. I'm sorry to be sort of slightly obtuse, but I don't want to go into the details of your question. Why don't you have another crack at it?
Well, point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm being pretty generous.
Oh, so you're happy for me to have another go without a penalty on supplementary?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, in that case, excellent. Does he agree with the soon-to-be Deputy Prime Minister's refusal to rule out leaving the coalition over the so-called Treaty Principles Bill? If so, what will he, as Prime Minister, do to avoid that?
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, it would not be respectful or democratic for me to seek to answer on behalf of another party's leader. But I can say, in comparison with a previous coalition I was in, 2017 and 2020, at this present time, what you see of this side of the House is the epitome of harmony.
Just another day in paradise, is it? Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Excuse me, just a minute. A little bit of order would be good.
Will he support a second reading of the Treaty Principles Bill immediately following the first, given he has already said that he won't support the second reading, meaning the Select Committee hearing would be a waste of time and money and, in his own words, be divisive?
Democracy.
Can I just say on behalf of the Prime Minister, this is in a document called the coalition document of the last elections decision, which has been out now for over 7 months. And I'd invite him and his ministerial colleagues babbling away now, because they know he's in difficulty, he can't even ask questions properly. And I'd invite the people in the gallery up there to go and read the coalition agreement and stop wasting Parliament's time.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
When you're ready.
Does he agree with Shane Jones, who said, quote, "The Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill will not be voted for by New Zealand First after its introduction to Parliament"? Christopher Luxon, who said National will pursue a Treaty Principles Bill to Select Committee and that's as far as it will go? Or David Seymour, who said he won't believe the Prime Minister won't, quote, "change his mind if the public really wants it"?
Mr Speaker, it's clearly in the coalition agreement, but I think one is entitled to believe that despite all of the previous statements, that if there was prevailing compelling evidence to change one's mind, as a famous economist once said, "When the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do?" However, in this case, we take the view of the most learned Maori, or dare I say, lawyer, to come to this Parliament, who got a degree in 2 years flat, and in 1922, 102 years ago, he set out what Maori then believed, and which we believe today, unlike these new people who decide in their woke manner, like Willie Jackson, all over the place, doesn't even stand up for the greatest leader Ngāti Porou ever had, and decides he knows better. No, sir. We are going to stick with a man called Ngāta, poor Maori, Buck, and a famous guy who was Deputy Prime Minister in my position all those years ago. 32 of us, mind you, and he said the same.
That's enough. Hang on, just a minute. If we're going to have that sort of barrage when a question is being answered to a question that was asked, then we'll revert to silence very, very quickly. The Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
So is the Prime Minister indicating, as he seems to have in his last answer, that he's open to changing his mind on the second reading of the Treaty Principles Bill?
Mr Speaker, what I was enunciating was what the Prime Minister said in the coalition agreement, as did we. But I did offer the opinion that sometimes, and I don't think it'll happen in this case, of course, obviously, but sometimes you do have a faint hope that others might have it right, but in the examples that I've given, that will not happen at this point in time. You know why? Because the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, according to Buck, do not. The Treaty of Waitangi, according to Peter Buck and to Paul Murray, and dare I say it, Carol, and dare I say it, the genius Ngāta, who got a law degree in 2 years flat, a record for any student in this country in law, there are no principles to the Treaty of Waitangi. And in 1987, 5 judges wrestling over the land case. I know why that member's laughing, because she knows nothing about the law. But in 87, the basis on which this is given, the land case, those 5 judges couldn't agree either. So stop coming here with your unlearned humbug.
Supplementary.
The Honourable David Seymour.
Is the Prime Minister aware of the
Mr.
Deputy
Seymour,
Prime
I'd like to address your lapel.
Oh, my apologies, Mr. Speaker. I now address you. Is the Prime Minister aware of the Deputy Prime Minister's favourite legal scholar in the Maori world?
Well, it's a long way wide of the wicket, so I could probably answer it for you.
Can I say, I know what the member expects as an answer, but no, it's not me. It's in this case, it's a famous man who I would thought that side there would admire, called Ngāta, who gained a presence around all of Maoridom for his legal esteem and his knowledge about the history of this country.
To the Prime Minister, if David Seymour won't take him at his word that he won't support the second reading of the Treaty Principles Bill, and the acting Prime Minister has indicated that he, the Prime Minister, is open to changing his mind on it, why should New Zealanders believe what he's saying on the Treaty Principles Bill?
Mr. Speaker, I can't answer that question other than to say, and I'm probably speaking for Mr. Seymour, it's in the good book, hope springs eternal.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
A point of order.
The acting Prime Minister, answering on behalf of the Prime Minister, cannot stand up and say that he cannot speak on behalf of the Prime Minister. It is his job. That is why he is here.
He didn't say that. He said he can't answer the question, which is a reasonable response, and then offered the hopeful position that hope springs eternal. So work out from that what you want.